So we are now on the extinguishment of sales. Okay, we will be discussing conventional redemption in this slide. Okay, so since sales is a contract, the grounds for the extinguishment of contracts in general, which we have discussed in our obligations in contracts, are also applicable to the contract of sales. But we will not anymore expound on them. Just for a review, let us mention them. Payment or performance, loss of the thing due, condonation or remission, confusion or merger, compensation, novation, annulment, rescission, and etc. Okay, for example, the seller has the obligation to deliver the determinate thing. So when he delivers, his obligation has been extinguished by payment or performance. Another example is, for example, the determinate thing was lost due to fortuitous event without mora culpa or dolo on the part of the seller. Then his obligation to deliver is also extinguished because of the loss of the thing due. Okay. On the other hand, the buyer, okay, who has the obligation to pay, if he pays his obligation, okay, then it is extinguished by payment or performance. Okay. So those are just examples for you to be reminded of these grounds. But this number one item will not be discussed thoroughly here because they have been discussed already in obligations and contracts. What is important is number 2 and number 3. Okay. So for the contract of sales, we also have as added grounds for extinguishment, we have conventional redemption and legal redemption. So these are applicable to sales only. So when we say conventional redemption, from the word convention meaning agreement, okay, this redemption is a kind wherein it is agreed by the parties, hence it is called conventional. Legal redemption, okay, from the word legal, this redemption is provided by law and not agreed upon by the parties. So for this slide, we will discuss conventional redemption. Okay, we will discuss legal redemption in another video. So let us define conventional redemption. Okay, conventional redemption is the right reserved by the vendor to repurchase the thing sold. Okay, meaning there can be a sale with stipulation or agreement by the parties that the vendor can repurchase the thing sold. Okay, and this sale is called sale with a right to repurchase or a sale a retro or a pacto de retro sale. Okay. Please remember class that this conventional redemption is not applicable to all kinds of sale. This will be applied only if the parties, okay, agreed in the contract, in the original contract of sale, that the vendor has the right to repurchase the thing sold. Okay, so this will be present only if there is such agreement or stipulation. Okay, this right is coupled with the obligation to return the price of the sale. Of course, kapag repurchase na ng original vendor, he must return the price of the sale. And whatever expenses of the original contract of sale, the vendor must also pay for those kasi it was incurred in the original sale, so bawiin ngayon, he has to pay for those expenses. He has also to pay for the other legitimate payments and necessary and useful expenses made on the thing sold. Okay, so therefore, the vendor must not only return the price of the sale, but he must also spend for those expenses of the original contract of sale and other legitimate payments, as well as the necessary and useful expenses that, okay, the buyer may have made on the thing sold. Take note that the expenses must be necessary and useful. So all those unnecessary and extravagant expenses will not be covered by this requirement. Hindi na yun babayaran. Yun lang necessary and useful expenses. Okay. This right to repurchase must be recognized in the same deed of sale. Okay. You might ask, however, what if sir, there is another document na doon nakasulat yung right to repurchase? Pwede din yun. For as long as the parties agreed that the vendor has the right to repurchase that thing. So, the right to redeem is a real right, meaning it can be enforced against the whole world or any third person who is not part of the contract. Okay. For example, uh, a seller sold a thing, but determined thing to a buyer, then later on, with the right to repurchase, then later the buyer sold the same property to Mr. X. Okay, so Mr. X, in the who is a third party, must recognize the right to redeem later on. If the original seller wants to redeem the property, Mr. X is bound to recognize the right to redeem because the right to redeem is a real right. Okay, it is not a personal right. Pag personal right kasi class, okay, you must remember that personal right is only applicable to the original parties, to the seller and to the buyer. But a real right is enforceable against the whole world. So the parties the sale a retro is called seller a retro and the buyer a retro. Okay. When you encounter this word a retro, okay, it means that the sale is with a right to repurchase. Okay. Take note class because this is a sale. There is a transfer of ownership from the seller to the buyer. Okay. Only that the seller can again repurchase. Okay. In the event that the seller will repurchase the sale, then another transfer of ownership from the buyer to the original seller will happen again. But take note that the original seller already transferred the ownership from the seller to the buyer, and once repurchase is made, the buyer now will transfer ownership back to the seller. Take note that the buyer, in the meantime, in a sale with the right to repurchase, the buyer, the original buyer, who has to whom the ownership has been transferred by the original sale, becomes the owner already, while the seller has not yet repurchased the thing. He is the owner already. Okay? Kapag repurchase lang ni seller, saka pa niya ibalik ang ownership to the original seller. But be reminded that in the original sale with the right to repurchase, there is already a transfer of ownership from the seller a retro to the buyer a retro. Now take note, if there is no agreement granting the vendor the right to redeem, then there is no right of redemption. Okay, hindi to automatic lang sa conventional redemption must be agreed upon. That is why it's called conventional. Another important note, the creditors of the vendor, for example, the vendor has many debts and the creditors is running after him. Okay. These creditors cannot redeem the property of the vendor if he has a sale with the right to repurchase. Okay. Hindi pwede i-redeem ng creditors para hati-hatian nila. What they can do is first exhaust the property of the vendor. If naubos na nila ang property of the vendor, that is the only time that they can go after the buyer a retro so that they can repurchase. Not take away class, but the creditors may repurchase the sale for themselves because the vendor has a debt, unpaid debt sa creditors niya. Okay. Be reminded that the creditors can go after the thing with the right to repurchase only if okay, they have exhausted the property of the original vendor. Okay, equitable mortgage. What is equitable mortgage? Yung kanina, ang pinag-usapan natin is sale with a right to repurchase. Okay. That right to repurchase is called conventional redemption. Okay, but the contract there is sale a retro or pacto de retro sale or sale with the right to repurchase. In contrast, there is another uh, um, agreement called equitable mortgage. Now, this equitable mortgage is not the same as your chattel mortgage and your real estate mortgage. Okay, because An equitable mortgage is one which, although it lacks the proper formalities of a true mortgage, like real estate or chattel mortgage, shows the intention of the parties to make the property subject to the contract as a security of the fulfillment of an obligation. Okay. Equitable mortgage class, from the word equitable, ang equitable, ang root word dyan is equity. Equity means, okay, what is fair and just applied to the parties. So the purpose of the law in calling this equitable mortgage is to be fair and just to the parties. So it is like a mortgage, but it is not really a mortgage, but it is considered by law as like a mortgage, okay, to be fair and just to the parties. Okay, let me explain in the next slide. So an equitable mortgage class is just like it's like a sale with a right to repurchase, but there is no transfer of ownership. Okay. Let us expound. A contract with the right to repurchase is presumed to be an equitable mortgage. Take note lang ha. The parties, sabi ng parties, we have a sale with the right to repurchase. But the law says, okay, you may call it sale with the right to repurchase, but insofar as the law is concerned, it will be called an equitable mortgage in any of the following cases. Number one, if the price of the sale with the right to repurchase is unusually inadequate. For example, 1 million ang land involved, tapos ang benta with the right to repurchase is only 100,000. So that is only 10% of the value. Therefore, the price is unusually inadequate. So the law says that is not really a sale. There is no transfer of ownership. That we will call that equitable mortgage. Okay, to be fair and just to the parties, meaning okay, the seller will remain the original owner and he can repurchase or redeem by paying the inadequate price back to the buyer. Number two, when the vendor remains in possession as a lessee or otherwise. Okay. After the expiration of the right to repurchase, another instrument extending the period of redemption is executed. Number four, the buyer retains for himself a part of the purchase price. The seller binds himself to pay the taxes on the thing sold, because the real intention of the parties is really not a sale, but to secure the payment of a debt or performance of an obligation. Okay, parang prenda. This provision of law class was included in the civil code because okay, yung sale with a right to repurchase has always been abused by certain individuals who want to take advantage of another. So the civil code included a provision pertaining to equitable mortgage. Because sometimes a contract is called sale with the right to repurchase, but if you look at the scenario, okay, it may be one of these 6 instances enumerated by the civil code. So the civil code says if the sale with the right to repurchase is one of these 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, then the law says in the eyes of the law it will not be a sale with the right to repurchase, but it will be called an equitable mortgage. There will be no transfer of ownership. To be fair to the original owner, that he can claim back the thing, okay, by returning the amount involved. Okay. And there is no transfer of ownership in equitable mortgage class. Because just like in any mortgage, pag nagprenda ka, hindi mo naman ibig sabihin pinamigay mo na yung thing, kundi pinahawak mo lang sandali. Because you will be later on redeeming it. So in case of doubt whether a contract which purports to be a sale with the right to repurchase, it shall be construed as an equitable mortgage. So, in a sale with the right to repurchase clause, we have to really look into the intention of the parties. If the intention of the parties is really to transfer ownership from the seller a retro to the buyer a retro, and with the intention to repurchase again later, or it is just an equitable mortgage where the real intention is really to secure a loan. That is why the enumeration in the previous slide is listed by the Civil Code as a guide for you to determine whether the sale with the right to repurchase is pacto de retro or an equitable mortgage. Okay. But in case of doubt, ibig sabihin, even after looking at the contract, you are not really sure whether it is pacto de retro sale or equitable mortgage. Okay. The correct interpretation, to be safe, you have to consider it, you have to construe it, you have to interpret it as an equitable mortgage. Okay. In this case, the apparent vendor, yung pagbenta, na kunwari, pacto de retro sale pero equitable mortgage pala, may ask for the reformation of the instrument so that the instrument will show not a pacto de retro sale but an equitable mortgage. So, pwede niya ipa-reform ang instrument for his benefit. What is the reason for this class? The reason is equitable mortgage affects a lesser transmission of rights than a contract of sale. Because in a contract of sale with the right to repurchase or pacto de retro sale, there is transfer of ownership. While in equitable mortgage, there is no such transfer. So, lesser transmission of rights ang equitable mortgage, which is more favorable to the original owner, which is just and fair according to the Civil Code. Okay, let us go into the actual redemption in a conventional redemption with the right to repurchase. Okay, so let us go back to pacto de retro sale. The seller, a retro, is sold a particular undetermined thing to the buyer a retro. Okay, agreeing that later on he can redeem the same property. Okay, what is the how many years it will be the period of redemption according to the Civil Code. If the parties have not agreed on a particular period, for example, the buyer and the seller a retro only agreed that there should be a right to redeem, but they forgot to include in their agreement, okay, as to how many years should the redemption be made. According to the Civil Code, if the parties forgot to agree on a period, then the redemption period is 4 years from the date of the contract. Yan ang nakasulat sa Civil Code class, date of the contract. But you should construe it or you should interpret the date of the contract as the perfection of the sale. The date that the sale has been perfected, meaning the date where the parties have a meeting of the minds. So, yun. Exhibit class, the parties can also agree on how many years. They can agree 1 year, 2 years, 3 years. If in that case, for example, the parties agreed 1 year lang. Pwede yun. 1 year. After 1 year, hindi na pwede redeem. 2 years lang ang redemption period. So after 2 years, hindi na pwede redeem. Pero if they forgot about the period, the Civil Code said, if you forgot, the redemption period shall be 4 years. Okay. What if the parties agree on the period of years? Pwede mag-agree. But according to the Civil Code, the period should not exceed 10 years. So the parties can agree 1 year, 2 years, 3 years, 4 years, 5 years, 6 years, 7 years, 8 years, 9 years, 10 years lang. Up to 10 years lang sila pwede mag-agree. If they agree on a particular year, then that will be followed. But they cannot agree more than 10 years. They cannot agree on 11 years, 12 years, 13 Pag nagsobra na ng 10 years class, if it exceeds 10 years, the agreement, for example, the agreement was the redemption can be made in 20 years. The law says, oh, up to 10 years only because that is the limit. Okay. So take note of these numbers. Okay. If the parties forgot to agree on a particular period, the period of redemption shall be 4 years. Okay. Or if the parties agreed on the period, you follow that period, but that period should not exceed 10 years. If the period agreed exceeded 10 years, you uh, uh, only consider 10 year at the 10-year period. Okay? So that after 10 years, hindi na pwede i-redeem. Okay, class? So, pwede, when you say redemption, okay, that is the period of redemption, I mean, that is the amount of time that is given to the seller to repurchase back, to repurchase the thing sold, okay, by returning the amount and paying for the expenses of the contract, necessary and useful expenses. Number 3, meron pa isa. Kahit na nag-expire na daw ang period to redeem, pero may pending case sa court about the subject. Okay? Because pinag-aawayan nila sa court kung facto de retrosale ba o equitable mortgage. Tapos sa tagal ng kaso sa court, sumobra na ng 4 years, sumobra na ng 10 years yung kaso. Okay? The civil code says, the seller will have 30 days from the final judgment of the court. When the court says it's a facto de retrosale, so from that point, you count 30 days because the seller can redeem within that period, 30 days from the final judgment. When the court says, okay, this case is not equitable mortgage but facto de retro. Tapos na yung 4 years, 10 years period to redeem. Okay, the law says, you still have 30 days. The seller still have 30 days from the final judgment of the court to make a redemption. Okay? Pagka nagsabi ang court, this is not facto de retrosale, this is equitable mortgage. With more reason na pwede mo i-redeem because that is just a mortgage, that is not a sale. Diba? Renda lang ang equitable mortgage eh. Okay, so the civil code is particular. When the final judgment says that the original contract is a facto de retrosale, facto de retro, ibig sabihin you can repurchase, then the seller retro can redeem within the 30-day period from the final judgment. If the judgment of the court happened on the 3rd year, the 2nd year, of course, this 4-year period and 10-year period will be followed. Mag-apply lang ang number 3 if the 10 years, 4 years period tapos na. Wala pa natapos ang ang case. Okay? Baka nagka-problema na si seller kung makaredeem ba siya o hindi. Kasi tapos na yung number 1 and number 2 na period. Ito 4 years and 10 years. The law says, do not worry because after the judgment of the court, you still have 30 days to redeem even if the period of 4 years, 10 years has already expired. So what will happen if no redemption is made within the redemption period? Number 1, the buyer's title becomes irrevocable. Hindi na pwede kunin ng seller doon sa buyer retro. Because he cannot redeem anymore because the redemption period has already lapsed or expired. But in the case of unremovable property, particularly land, okay, it becomes irrevocable pa rin. Okay? It cannot be redeemed pa rin. But if you go to the register of deeds, the register of deeds will ask for a court order before he will transfer the title from the seller to the buyer. Okay. There is no question, class, that whether the removable properties, the buyer has become the revocable owner of the removable properties. Wala question doon. He is now the new owner. But the register of deeds will say, because this is required by law. Okay, still go to court, ask the court to issue an order for the transfer of the title. Okay, so take note, kaning number 2 will only apply to immovable properties like land. Okay, yung title ng lupa, hindi pa pwede muna i-transfer from the buyer to the seller without a court order. But there is no question whether kung sino may-ari. The may-ari is already the buyer because the seller, retro, cannot anymore redeem. Okay, the buyer is now the new owner, but para ma-transfer yung pangalan ng title, he needs a court order by going to court so that the register of deeds will transfer the title to the new owner. Okay, there are other specific scenarios pertaining to immovable properties which we should not skip because they might ask this in the exam. So these are clear provisions in the civil code, that is why we should discuss these scenarios. Scenario number 1. Take note class, these 5 scenarios that I will be discussing will only apply to immovable properties. Ibig sabihin, lupa, land, okay, land and building, and so on. Anything that is attached to the land. So scenario number 1, a vendor sold with the right to repurchase a portion of his immovable property to a vendee. Later, the vendee or the buyer has acquired the whole property. I don't know how he made it. Siguro nabili niya na naman later. Pero yung purchase with the right, yung sale with the right to repurchase is only for a portion of the property. Now, the vendor who sold the portion with the right to repurchase, if he wants to redeem, the vendee may compel the vendor to redeem the whole property. Okay, klaro ba? Take note class that the word used by the law is may. Ibig sabihin, pwede gawin ng vendee, pwede rin hindi. Okay, ibig sabihin, if the vendor sold with the right to repurchase only a portion of the land to a buyer, but later on the buyer has acquired the whole property na, but yung portion lang ang may right to repurchase. Okay, if the original vendor will ask for to redeem the property, the vendee can of course agree, o sige, balik yung portion. Pwede yun. But the vendee is given the choice to either allow the repurchase of the portion only, or he may also require the original seller to redeem the whole property. Okay, take note that this choice is granted by law to the vendee a retro or to the buyer. He may or may not compel the vendor to redeem. So if the vendee, the buyer a retro, will compel the vendor to redeem the whole property, wala siya magawa because that is provided for by law, that the vendee may compel the vendor to redeem the whole property even if only a portion was sold with the right to repurchase to the buyer a retro. So I hope that's clear. Okay, scenario number 2. Co-owners. Maraming may-ari. Isang lupa lang, maraming may-ari. Co-owners jointly, not solidarily. So jointly and in the same contract sold with the right to repurchase an undivided immovable property. So isang lupa lang, hindi pa nila na-divide. Co-owners sila marami. They sold the whole property. Sila lahat jointly agreed. Ibenta natin with the right to repurchase to a particular buyer. Then later on, if they want to redeem, they can only redeem their individual shares. Okay? So, hindi pwede i-redeem ng isa lang, i-redeem niya lahat. Hindi pwede. Because As co-owners, they are only entitled to the portion na kanilang share. For example, dalawang owners, isang land. Tapos ang share, hati-hati. Then they sold the whole property with the right to repurchase to a buyer. So if only one will redeem, he can redeem only half, not the whole property. Because that is only his share. Of course, he can redeem everything if the parties agree. Pati yung isang owner. Yung co-owners agreed with the buyer agreed that the one person can repurchase the whole thing. Pwede yun, basta nag-agree sila. But if there is no agreement to that, okay, if only one of the owner will redeem, he can only redeem his share. Okay, that's clear. Scenario number 3. A loan vendor, isa lang siya. Sold with the right to repurchase an immovable property. Isa lang din ang property. Isang vendor, isang property with the right to repurchase. Later, the vendor died, leaving several heirs. Maraming tagapagmana. And this tagapagmana will inherit also the right to repurchase. Now, if none of the heirs may exercise a right of redemption for more than their respective share. So later on, if the an heir, isa sa heir, would like to redeem, he can only redeem his share, not the whole property. Okay, because the whole property must be shared by the several heirs. So one heir can only redeem his share. However, the vendee again, yung nagbumili, may. Again, the word used is may. Pwede niya demand, pwede hindi. Okay, may choice siya. The vendee may demand that all the co-heirs come to an agreement upon the purchase of the whole thing. Should they fail to do so, the vendee cannot be compelled to consent to partial redemption. Take note. Si buyer, originally isa lang ang vendor, isa lang ang buyer with the right to repurchase, but the vendor, yung original na may-ari, died leaving several heirs. The rule is, one heir can only redeem a portion, yung share nyo lang. But the buyer, yung buyer retro, yung bumili, may demand that the co-heirs should agree to purchase the whole thing. Okay? And then if they will not purchase the whole thing, the vendee cannot be compelled, hindi siya pwede pilitin for a partial redemption. Okay? But if the vendee agree for a partial redemption, choice niya yun. Okay? So the vendee or the buyer may or may not require full redemption. He may agree also to partial redemption. But in the event that the vendee will require the purchase of the whole thing, walang magawa yung heirs because this choice is given by law to the vendee, not to the heirs. Scenario number 4. Co-owners, marami na namang may-ari, separately sold. Kanina, jointly sold, ngayon separately sold. With the right to repurchase an undivided immovable property. So for example, say A and B, owner of a particular land. Si A, binenta niya with right to repurchase, yung share niya. Si B, ganun din. Separately, ginawa nila yun. So each of them may independently exercise the right of repurchase as regards his own share, and the vendee cannot compel him to redeem the whole property. Okay? Because separately ang pagkasold. Kanina kasi, yung maraming co-owners, jointly. Jointly yun, yung scenario number 1 ba yun? O 1, 2? So, kaya may underline yung separately. So, kapag co-owners sold separately, right to repurchase, of course, they can only redeem what they have sold and not the whole property because the whole property was not sold jointly. Last scenario number 5. A vendor, isa lang, sold with the right to repurchase an immovable property to a vendee. Isa lang din ang vendee. Later, the vendee died. O this time naman, yung buyer naman namatay. Kanina kasi, yung namatay yung vendor. Yung isang scenario. This time, ang namatay yung buyer. And then the buyer leave several heirs. The vendor must redeem from each of the heirs for their respective share. Okay, dahil. So, i-redeem niya sa yung share, yung property sa isa doon sa every heir because every heir has the right. So, hindi niya pwede i-redeem ang whole property sa isang heir lang. Must be from each of the heirs for their respective share. However, if the immovable property has been awarded to only one of the heirs, the vendor should redeem the whole property from said heir. Okay. Baka kasi class dalawa the property has been inherited by only one of the heirs, then another property yung isa. So kung isa lang may-ari na heir, doon ka na sa isang may-ari na heir mag-redeem the whole property, not from each of the heir. Okay, please take note of these 5 scenarios. Pakitanong nila. This only involves immovable properties. Fruits. Okay, fruits. So, the civil code said, the parties to the sale are retro may make stipulation as to the fruits of the land. Okay, so lupa pa rin. Lupa pa rin. Binenta with the right to repurchase. Tapos yung lupa may growing fruits, growing trees, growing plants na may fruits. Okay. The parties can agree as to the fruits. Anong mangyari dun sa fruits? Bayaran ba ng vendi? Bayaran ba ng vendor? O hindi nila i-consider yung fruits? That is their choice. Okay. They are free to agree on that. If they have not agreed on the fruits, the following rules will apply. The civil code, okay, if you do not want to agree on the fruits, then the civil code said, then you have to follow these rules. Number 1, if at the time of the execution of the sale, there will be visible or growing fruits, there shall be no prorating at the time of redemption if no indemnity was paid by the vendee. Okay, so lupa, may fruits. Wala silang pakialam dun sa fruits. Yung lupa lang ang sale retro. Then later on, pag-redeem, wala ding consideration about sa fruits. Okay? May bayad lang if ganito. Seller, may land with fruits, sabi ng seller. Oh, I will sell this with the right to repurchase. Kaya lang may fruits, bayaran mo rin yung fruits. Na later on, gusto niya i-redeem, sabi ni buyer, oh, you have to return yung bayad sa lupa. I-return mo rin yung bayad ng fruits. Okay, that is letter A. Letter B, at the time of the execution of the sale or retro, there should be no fruits, but the fruits at the time of redemption, the fruits must be prorated between the vendor and the vendee. Ibig sabihin, class, ibig sabihin dito, yung originally, when the sale was made, there are no fruits. But during redemption, may fruits. If the parties do not agree, do not have any stipulation or do not have no agreements as to fruit, the law says, yung fruit at the time redemption must be divided between the vendor and the vendee. May binigay na computation ang civil code, but do not bother with that anymore because we will not be asked to compute for this. Just know that there is this rule. Okay? Baka tanungin lang. That would be all for conventional redemption.